Hello, welcome to Farmgate. I'm ffinlo Costain, editor of 8.9.com. In April, a jury of farmers ruled unanimously that UK farming should play its part in meeting government climate and nature ambitions. But they warned that net zero is disengaging farmers, with many questioning how farming's impact is being measured, as well as the practicality and validity of the proposed interventions. The two-day farmers' jury was conducted earlier in the year through the AFN Network Plus. To discuss the report, I'm joined by Dr. Amy Jackson, a behaviour change expert who set up and ran the farmers' jury. I'm also joined by two farmers who took part: Adrian Ivory, a partner at Strathisla Farms in Perthshire in Scotland, and Liz Warner from Wells Head Natural Capital. Welcome all. Amy, what was the motivation behind the farmers' jury? Why did AFN Network Plus want to run it in the first place?
Well, actually, they didn't set out to run it. I set out to run it. What they set out to do was to include behaviour change in their suite of topics they wanted to include in terms of how do we get the food system towards net zero. So I was a behaviour change champion that year, and I decided one of the things I wanted to focus on, or the main thing, was farmer behaviour change. How are we going to engage farming in this? Because at the end of the day, emissions, as people are measuring them, 70% comes from primary food production. Yet you go to conferences and you go and see people speak, and again, people are ignoring the importance of engaging farmers who are the food producers and who are generating these emissions. So why do they continually get excluded? And I think we need to hear their voices. It's so important, because if we can actually discuss what their views are and try and find the overlap and work on that, then that's how we'll get progress.
Indeed, there's no change on the ground unless you've got the people on the ground sort of paid into the idea that change needs to happen. And just to clarify, you said 70% of emissions are linked to primary production. Of course, that's 70% of emissions in connection to the food system, I'm guessing, not
Absolutely, yeah,
overall.
absolutely. In the food system. So,
Yeah.
it ranges in livestock production. They're measuring around 95% in some sectors. It's less for arable and fresh produce, but it averages out around
Yeah.
70%. So it's significant if you're looking at food and that's how you're measuring it, then why aren't we talking to farmers?
Now, I said this in the intro, but just to be clear, because I think it's really important to frame this conversation in context when we're talking about net zero. Was there ever any sense in the design of the jury that there isn't a climate and nature crisis?
This was a really interesting point, because the first question, the first charge that the jury had to answer was, should UK food and farming, or farming, play a role in helping the government meet its targets? And unanimously they said yes. And I was really surprised, because I thought there might be some rejection of that, but everybody got the point that they can see what the government's trying to do. They might not agree with how they're measuring it, but they know they need to play a part in that. So, and I think also farmers are at the front end of this. They're seeing the climate changing. They're seeing the impacts of more extreme weather. I think what is differing is what's actually causing it, and where we need to act is the challenge.
Now, Liz, why did you want to take part in the event, and how do you feel about climate change and the state of UK nature?
So I farm down in Devon with my husband on a county council tenant farm actually as well. So I see things from lots of different routes. I'm also a farm consultant and work with the natural capital firm that you discussed earlier. So I think I wanted to take part for a number of reasons. First and foremost, I think it's really important that farmers have a voice around this table and a seat for the debate. The beauty of the farmers' jury was the fact that we had so many experts put in front of us, and sort of the ability to really question them and probe their thoughts. And I think it's just, agriculture is often incentivized by government and has to be fairly reactive to government policy. And I think all of this is changing, and having a seat around that table and being able to be part of that change and that discussion is really important. So, yeah, I do believe climate change is occurring. We can't have a human population the scale that we've got, and industry and associated emissions, without it throwing our natural balances out of kilter. And nature's been in decline for a number of years, and I think agriculture is often seen as the culprit. But actually, with nature decline, net zero, we're one of the few industries that can be part of the solution.
You mentioned the sort of panel of experts, the experts that came and spoke to you all. As you say, that's a rather privileged position to be in, isn't it? And I just wonder if you could tell me a few of the areas that were covered by the experts.
Well, we had experts there. We had people from DEFRA that were involved in policy. We had the scientists that were responsible for sort of interpreting the science and helping inform the sort of policy discussions around that. We had research institutions that were talking about the sort of newer research and sometimes the struggles that they had to get the policymakers to listen to that. So it was really, oh, and we had farmers as well talking about their experience. So I think it was brilliant in the fact that it was such a rounded discussion to really give us a brilliant overview of where it's at.
Adrian, why did you want to take part in the jury? And are you in any way sceptical of the climate and nature challenge that we face?
Good morning. So the reason I wanted to take part was I'm a fairly practical and realistic type of person, and I wanted to make sure that those practical and realism was brought to the table from a farmer's point of view. There's lots of people who sit behind a desk with a computer and come up with all sorts of solutions that look marvelous on a computer screen, and then it's someone else's job to do that in the field. Well, I just wanted to make sure that us as the jury, especially from my point of view, had the opportunity to say, well, hang on a minute, before you implement that policy, have you thought about the reality of this, that, and the other thing? Am I a skeptic? No, the climate has changed. We've seen what I would praise it as is we've seen the weather move by a month. So we used to get snow in November. That now doesn't come until December. We used to think that spring started in March. It now starts in April. So we've seen everything move a month. The amount of rainfall that we get annually has probably only increased by 2 or 3%. So we are certainly seeing things, and I just wanted to help sort of stop any further issues happening.
Yeah, and just in terms of, you've talked about the way in which the climate or the weather has sort of moved forwards a month where you're farming. Are you noticing an increase in unpredictability as well? You mentioned that rainfall had gone up a little bit, but is it sort of coming in sort of fits and bursts more than as a continual dreek drizzle?
Well, as you all know, farmers are never happy with the weather. It's either too dry, too wet, too windy, or too cold. But certainly with the rainfall, this in the last few years, when it's come, it seems to come in a much heavier burst rather than being much nicer over a week. I'm sure most people would prefer it in a burst and get back to enjoying the sunny weather. But as a farmer, we actually quite enjoy the sort of drawn out longevity of the rainfall before getting back into sunny, warmer weather.
Amy, let's talk about the jury itself, just how it was set up and run. I wonder if you could talk us through that and maybe who was invited and why those particular people were chosen.
Well, we based it on the citizen jury process, which was first developed in the US by the Jefferson Center about 50 years ago. And it's been used for quite a long time in the US, and increasingly we're seeing it in the UK. So it's applied to kind of controversial projects such as big renewable scale projects, turbines, things like that, things that affect the community. And what tends to happen is that a very broad representative sample of the community is recruited through a very sort of balanced process. So you're really, you have quotas of different types of people that fill different sort of groups within the community. Now, what happened with us is this is the first time, to my knowledge, that this sort of process has been applied to farmers. First of all, farmers, I think, kind of are the citizens of the food and farming system because they're the ones with the least power at the bottom that tend to get all the stuff pushed on them. So I see them as the citizens of the food and farming community. However, there's diversity in there in terms of enterprise, in terms of location, in terms of gender, in terms of scale of farm. So what I set out to do was to try and tick those boxes as much as possible. So to get a broad representation of different types of industry, but we don't have the luxury of being able to recruit farmers in the same way. They are very, very short of time. They are absolutely fed up of having their brains picked all the time, and nothing changes as a result. So what I did is I ran a survey to try and understand farmer views, producer views of the different climate change mitigation things that are going on at the moment. And as part of that, I asked those taking part whether they would be interested in this jury process, and I was really surprised that a quarter, I think more than 100 people came back and were really up for it. And from that, we whittled it down, availability of dates and so on, to the 16 we eventually got. But I was amazed that every single person who agreed to, was recruited and came onto that panel of 16, turned up in London, gave up 2.5 days, really, or even 3 days to do this, and were really, really motivated, because this is about your voice being heard. And also, it's a chance to understand what the people who are making the decisions, why they're making these decisions, what's behind it, and to be heard about your views on that. And I think that was the really valuable process. People kind of gave it that opportunity and hoped it would be that. And it sounds, hopefully, from what Adrian and Liz say, they got that. But it's about, we don't get heard. And if you think about all the communications from farming, they tend to be channeled through the farming unions. And the farming unions do a great job, but everything's politicized through them, because that's the nature of what they do. So therefore, where is the opportunity for government and people who are making policy decisions to actually hear the experiences of grassroots farmers and to respond and change as a result?
So could you talk me through a few of the key takeaways from the report?
Well, I think the main thing, as I said at the start, was a surprise that everybody actually felt we need to engage, we need to support, we need to be part of this. However, there were sort of some other parts as well to do with a lack of recognition of the balancing role that farming plays. It doesn't just produce food, it doesn't just produce emissions, it also deals with nature, it deals with communities, it has a whole kind of soil health, it has a whole raft of different functions. And when you start to boil it down to one outcome, which is greenhouse gas emissions, you lose sense of all the other complex things that farmers do in terms of managing nature, managing soil, managing natural processes, being part of communities, all that kind of stuff. So it was really the lack of balance we have at the moment, and the lack of recognition of all these complex other consequences that can happen if you just focus on one outcome.
And just on that, Amy, you obviously had lots of experts there. This was the feedback that was clearly coming from the jury. Was there recognition amongst those experts that that there was this siloization taking place?
I'll just give you one example. Vera Ivory, who's a really preeminent climate scientist with SRUC in Edinburgh, she said to me, "This is the best conversation I've had with farmers, full stop," because there was that, they could understand where she was coming from. And I saw when she was talking, there was a kind of a light bulb moment, I feel. I don't know if Liz and Adrian want to comment on that, but it was almost like that's why people are going down this route. And this is what this means. And there was this frank discussion, which you just don't get the time to have. Everything gets filtered, everything gets pushed down. Whereas when you actually allow not just people who are talking to farmers to hear farmers' views, but farmers to hear why people are making those decisions, then you start to get engagement and appreciation of each other's position, and then people start to come together. And that was what I was hoping would happen.
I interrupted you, and I just wonder if you could talk us through the other takeaways.
Well, just that we need change, I think. I mean, we need to have this recognition of the fact that there's a balance. The goal is wrong. And who knows this, that farming in the UK is not expected to reach net zero. That is in the Climate Change Committee's budget. It is not expected at any point to reach net zero. Farming is not. So
what is it expected to reach?
Well, it's
just for clarity.
To cut emissions, and you're going to ask me the figure, and I haven't got it off the top of my head.
I think it's 40. I think it's about 45%. Something like that. I was
going to say 40%. So, and I don't think that has come across. So people just keep hearing net zero, net zero. They think their farm has to reach net zero. They think the farming industry has to reach net zero. This has become a really distorted conversation, and people have just quite rightly gone into siege mentality because they're being asked to do the impossible. So I think that is a really interesting point, is where is, like, net zero is just completely paralyzing the discussion. That was a major finding from the group, was net zero is just putting everybody off. It's just stalling any progress, because it's a single metric, it doesn't have any balance, and it's impossible. So therefore, what we need to do is we need to adjust the goal to a goal that people can actually see as realistic and it's logical, and then we can work towards that together. And also we need change, not just the change of the goal, but change of how there's engagement with the farming industry, so that actually there's this more two-way process. And we had a great presentation from Martin Kennedy, Adrian. I mean, he's a super leader, former president of the NFU Scotland, who talks about ARIOB, which is the, I'm not going to get this right now, but I think it's the Agricultural Reform Implementation Design Board in Scotland. And they are focusing on this engagement process and co-design, co-development of both policy and implementation. So that's actually a fantastic development. And in Wales, they've had a similar pushback against initial targets and initial policy, and that's been reformed to be more in line with what farmers feel is achievable. And that's where we need to go. We need to have this dialogue, not a monologue from government.
Yeah. And just to sort of clarify that figure, it was 45%. I've just looked it up. And of course, that's by 2050, just to put it in time context as well. Liz, what did you like about the farmers' jury approach?
I think the farmer jury approach was brilliant. And I mean, Amy touched on it and we've spoken about it, just the number and variation of experts that were put in front of us. And I think what was really nice was that both the farmers and the experts came to the table with a really open, ready to discuss sort of mentality, which meant conversation wasn't combative. It wasn't, it was just a really good discussion on all these issues and actually how we can work together or how things should be looked at differently. One of the jurors pointed out that actually between us, our farmers jury, our 16 people, had something like over 400 years of farming experience between us. And, that can't be ignored when it comes to looking at these different challenges that policy and farming's facing.
Yeah, fantastic. Interestingly, the Farmers' Jury report came out in the same week that the Tony Blair Institute released its report onto net zero, which I think came to reasonably broadly similar conclusions, that net zero policy is not as effective as it could be, that it's polarising, and that there may well be better ways of delivering improved climate outcomes. Why do you think net zero as a policy may be slowing progress on reducing farm emissions?
Yeah, so as a farming policy, and I think Amy touched on it a minute ago, it's not achievable for the majority of farming businesses. And actually, arguably, should it be achievable in some ways, in that we as a farm are producing food? It is one of the few things in that we absolutely rely on and we need to have. So I think policy probably needs to be focused more on developing sort of sustainable, more climate resilient agricultural systems. And so sort of during the farmer jury process, one of the frustrations experienced by the jury was all this siloed thinking and the fact that there wasn't that joined up thinking between on the ground agriculture and, like Adrian said earlier, the ability for us to actually put into place some of these policies. So I think, we need this co-design with industry to really try and look at the problem practically.
Do you have a sense of why it is that this siloization continues? Because often when I have conversations with people within institutions, they will agree with me that there are, that what they're thinking about is in a silo, that it's very difficult to kind of, join up that policy discussion with other people, or even when they are policy makers, then decision makers, politicians, are still focusing on the emissions element. Why is that, do you think?
I think sometimes it feels like they might look at the science and there's an easy thing that they understand that they can target. And I think it's probably an easy way out sometimes, but actually when it comes to practical delivery on the ground, it's not the route.
So it's a way of appearing to make progress rather than necessarily actually making progress. I guess that's at the root of this whole sort of conversation about net zero. How can we make progress, and is net zero the best way? Adrian, what's your view on net zero and how it's been applied in relation to farming?
So I think the first thing, and I think Amy may have raised it already, the crucial thing here is that the perception out with farmers is that net zero is zero emissions. That's not true. Net zero is a bit like accounting. So you have inputs and outputs, and you get to net zero. And everyone that you speak to, I'm going to the Highland Show this week, and I know that there will be conversations about net zero basically being zero emissions. And it's like, that isn't the case. So there needs to be a much broader and better understanding on that, because it feels like policymakers think that farming is the silver bullet to take net zero to achieve their goals, but that's not true. In fact, I think one of the jurors came up with and asked one of the policymakers, how would you feel if agriculture was 100% of the emissions? And they looked slightly perplexed and scratched their head a bit. And we said, well, that would basically mean that everything else was below zero, whether that is the internet, which gets talked about rarely, and we can cover that later, whether that's transport, whether that's packaging, whatever. Because realistically, producing food, you are not going to get to net zero. I'm not saying that don't need to make improvements, and we all want to make improvements, but don't sort of push us down saying you must get to net zero, otherwise this is the consequence, and you're going to be tarred with this brush. I think another thing that I find quite difficult and interesting in the same way is that I'm in farming for life. I suspect Liz is as well, and all the majority of the jurors have been in farming, as Liz pointed out, for a long time. But a lot of the policymakers are worried about what's happening in 5 years' time so that they keep their job. We are looking way ahead into the future, whereas their future is not so quite far down the line. And sometimes that can be a bit difficult in policy making.
And indeed, you're not just looking a long way into the future, but you have a long memory of the way that government has behaved. And just because this government is new, it doesn't mean that there wasn't a previous government before it. And of course, the way that farming works, the way that farmers deliver food production has been directed very closely by government policy over the course of decades with the for the farm support payments.
A classic example is we've just put the bulls in with the cows now. So it takes 9 months, 9 and a bit months to have a calf. Then to take that calf through to finishing is another year to 2 years. So the decisions I'm making today don't receive any income for another 3 years. So it's a much longer drawn out process.
And when you talked about what if farming was 100% of the emissions, just to sort of clarify there, and I know you did to an extent, you're not suggesting that everybody else should carry the weight and the burden of climate mitigation and farming should be left to itself, are you? You are suggesting that that we all need to play a part, but it needs to be proportionate.
Correct. We all need to play the part, and we all need to improve. Is it realistic for the other industries to get to net zero? I throw that question out there. I don't know the answer to that. What I do know, in my opinion, is that it is very, very difficult. And I think, as you pointed out, and Amy pointed out, the Climate Change Committee have said we need to reduce it to 40%. So there is realism there that we won't get to net zero.
Yeah, there is a recognition. Adrian, you said once before in a conversation that we had that the focus on agriculture ought to be on profitability, that should be the key thing, and that no farm can be sustainable if it's not profitable. It's that old idea that you can't be green if you're in the red. How are farming profitability and emissions reduction connected in your view?
So a couple of things here. I really believe that if farmers are not profitable, they're not even thinking about net zero emissions, or they're more worried about keeping themselves afloat, keeping their families fed, and just trying to go virtually from day to day, which isn't a good place to be in. In order to be sustainable, you need to be profitable. And in terms of net zero, the way that farming can improve things by becoming more efficient, being able to purchase more modern machinery, which is more efficient fuel usage, etc., they are costly. I'll give you an example. When I bought this farm in 1970, I didn't, sorry, I wasn't alive then. When my parents bought the farm in 1970, you needed 50 tons of wheat to buy an arable tractor. Today, at today's prices, you need 700 tons of wheat to buy an arable tractor. That is a huge difference. And it's similar, you know, whether it's cattle or sheep or whatever. In order to purchase these extremely expensive bits of kit, you have to have the profitability and also the confidence that that profitability is going to remain. Otherwise, people won't do it. They're just trying to get through the day, trying to live more mouth to mouth, if that makes sense.
And presumably, when we're looking at the benefits of emissions reduction in terms of profitability, we're also looking at things like reducing inputs that are high cost, being able to incorporate renewables, for example, into your farm system so that your own electricity bills come down because you're more self-reliant.
Yeah, totally. And I implemented a system yesterday. Didn't cost a huge amount of money, but it instantly showed me on my computer areas of fields through satellite imagery which are not going to be that profitable. And over the years going forward, I will be able to lay these maps on top of each other so that I can then take a decision on an area of a field which is constantly losing me money and say, right, let's take that out of production and put that into whether it's trees or whether it's a more bird food or whatever it is, into an area which isn't costing me money and is benefiting to the environment.
Fantastic. Liz, just very quickly on natural capital, because as well as farming, you're obviously working for Wells Head Natural Capital now, or part of that company as well. We've done a lot on natural capital, different natural capital income streams, and the way that they can help to create additional income streams for farmers to support food production, quite apart from anything else. Do you have any view on, which you think are the best forms of natural capital for farmers to be investigating at the moment? Which are the easiest ones for most farmers to get involved with?
So you've obviously got the markets that are functioning at the moment. You've got the biodiversity net gain market that's definitely
in
functioning in England, sorry. And you've got woodland carbon as well. I think they're probably the two easiest, most accessible markets at the moment that are trading. I think for farmers, we do need policies changing. I think the U-turns that we're seeing with regards to farm support or SFI or capital grants, that's making decisions quite difficult. Farmers are having to take short-term views on certain things. I think the natural capital markets can open up opportunities for a longer-term view with regards to integrating those farm and nature diversifications into the farm businesses. And with those longer-term views comes sort of longer-term payment models.
Now, one of my concerns with net zero is that it is very emissions centric, which works pretty well with other industries, but doesn't really make sense for farming. Agricultural land use and farming activity, as we know, both emit carbon, but farmland can also sequester carbon. So we need to think in terms of carbon cycling rather than just emissions. When we spoke previously, you mentioned carbon tunnel vision. What do you think are the dangers of carbon tunnel vision?
Yeah, I think carbon tunnel vision is one of probably the biggest dangers with this net zero debate. And that is focusing on carbon reduction at the absolute exclusion of everything else. Talking about natural capital markets, you're talking about biodiversity loss, water quality. And I think that's the biggest fear. I also, as a farmer, I believe we should have a good sustainable food production system within the UK. We're good at producing food, high quality food, high welfare food, and pretty good sustainable food. And I think if we look towards this carbon tunnel vision, the risk is that we're going to end up offshoring our food to other countries that might not have such high sustainability goals or such high welfare ambitions.
Yeah, so the danger is that thing that we were talking about to begin with, that if we just think about carbon, we potentially miss so many other things and potentially make some of those other things worse in the actions that we're taking to focus on emissions alone.
Absolutely, yeah, definitely.
Adrian, you farm in Perthshire. Scottish government wants to reduce emissions from farming by 48% by 2035. So that's different to the overall UK approach. They see a reduction in cattle numbers as part of their strategy to achieve this. Do you think livestock reduction is the right approach?
As a livestock farmer, I'm do not think this is the right approach at all. And I suppose if we
Do,
look
do
at
you
it,
understand where they're coming from? And do you agree with the basic premise, or do you just think they're completely barking up the wrong tree?
I think someone has sat at a computer and thought cattle emissions well, we can reduce emissions quickly by reducing numbers. And the thing that concerns me is that some data has been produced recently. So if our cattle numbers continue to fall at the rate they're going at the moment, by 2030, that's only 5 years away, we will need to import 278,000 tonnes of beef. So there are numbers out there that some people think that red meat consumption is reducing. And the latest data that I have seen says that it's not reducing, or if anything, it's stagnant. But the thing that is forgotten is that the population is growing, and therefore red meat consumption is actually growing. The thing that really concerns me is that, going back to what some of Liz said, is that we're prepared to import some of this red meat, which doesn't have the same standards that we set our own selves, but also that actually they say, well, the carbon for producing that red meat resides with the country that produced it, and therefore it's coming in sort of net zero emissions, whatever. That's a real concern to me, because surely we are one planet and the UK is 1% of the planet. And if we are, it's not like the sort of the atmosphere above the UK says, "Oh, just wait, we're coming over the UK. They're zero, so we won't do any climate change there. We'll skirt around them and move over to Europe." I think we've got to have a sensible approach to this. And in Scotland, where I am, we are set up to produce great red meat, whether that's cattle, sheep, pigs, whatever you want to look at, because we have a vast areas of ground which is not suitable for anything other than grazing livestock. And I think there needs to be, there's an education lesson here, both policymakers as well as the public, as in consumers, but also farmers, to understand everyone's language and also to understand what the end goals are.
There's a real challenge there, isn't it? Because as you say, an awful lot of Scotland is prime grazing land, really. It's what that land is good for. And if you were to take the livestock off and simply use that land for, well, what? Poorly producing other food types that the land isn't suitable for, or perhaps for rewilding, then you're changing from one use of land to another, equally inefficient, when actually you could be using that land to deliver a whole range of things. And if you see livestock as being part of an integrated system where you're able to draw down carbon as well. So again, back to that carbon tunnel vision thing, at the same time as improving biodiversity, improving water cycling, etc. You're getting lots from that same piece of land, but you need the livestock to do it.
And I think you're seeing in a lot of these more recent projects, they've all said livestock are critical to making it a success. Whereas 3 or 4 years ago, it was like, get rid of all livestock, we don't want them. And going back to what I said previously, this is my concern, is that this is in short cycles. The policymakers are going, oh yeah, just get rid of them. Oh no, actually we need them. There's a very simple way of looking at things, certainly up here, that if you go out of cattle, you will not go back in. And I highlighted the reason why before, is that you go to the bank to borrow some money, and the bank manager says, well, when are you going to give me some return? You're like, well, sorry, I need a bit more money to feed them, and I need a bit more money to do this. It's 3 years before you see a return, and therefore people won't go back into it. So we've got to get away from these short-termism policies, which are suddenly U-turned and gone, oh, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, because we'll be too far down the road by the time the U-turn happens.
Liz, the UK is seen as one of the countries in the world that has managed to cut its emissions, a lot more than many others. But an awful lot of this has been linked to our industry and manufacturing being sort of closed down here and going elsewhere, that we're now importing a vast amount from China, and all the emissions are associated with China and China's policy rather than our own. You mentioned offshoring before. I wonder if you could just talk us through your own definition of that, and particularly what you're concerned about in terms of food production, what you think might be offshored if we take the wrong approach on climate mitigation.
So it's following on from Adrian's point, really, that, I'm in sunny Devon, and Devon very much is a livestock capital as well. Because we can't, we have land that is suitable for arable production, but we also have land that is absolutely not suitable for arable production and is definitely grazing land. I think linking it with that carbon tunnel vision and, some of this reduction in meat consumption or production, if we're offshoring our meat production, our red meat production, you cannot compare the emissions from my cow grazing a Devon hillside with some lovely sustainable grass versus a massive feedlot in America that's also producing beef, but in a very, very different way with a very, very different carbon footprint. So that's my concern with offshoring, is that, it's all well and good having policies in this country that are incentivizing net zero or trying to reduce our red meat consumption, red meat production. But there are likely to be unintended consequences, because we will then be purchasing that from other countries that may not have the same ambitions as we do. And, piggybacking on Adrian's point again, it's global. Emissions problem is a global problem. It is not just a UK problem.
Yeah, absolutely. Amy, metrics were part of the farmers' jury discussion, and they were an important feature in your report. Now, farmers were particularly concerned about the way that the climate impact of methane is assessed. GWP 100, which is the standard metric, seriously overemphasises the warming impact of stable ongoing emissions from short-lived gases such as methane. And so it's always going to distort the impact of a ruminant farm system. Does the way that we measure methane have to change for livestock farmers to regain trust in the government's approach to climate mitigation?
I think it does, to be honest. It is a real sticking point, and Adrian raised it earlier. It's almost like this low-hanging fruit that people outside the industry are seeing, is like, because methane is 30 times more warming than carbon dioxide over 100 years, it's like, oh, we'll have some of that. We can actually cut methane quite quickly. Only last 12 years. If we start cutting it, if we remove the livestock industry, then bingo, suddenly we get these massive reductions. But it doesn't alter the big gorilla in the room problem, or elephant in the room, is that the carbon dioxide emissions just continue to keep going and keep accumulating. And so there's two issues here. One is that it's this kind of short-termism, which you can't turn the clock back then, because you can't reintroduce cattle, you can't reintroduce ruminants, because that will suddenly raise emissions massively. But you're also not tackling the big issue, which is carbon dioxide, which takes thousands of years to break down. So it's just this kind of grabbing hold of short-term solutions, which is a bit of what both the others in this call have talked about. Both Adrian and Liz have talked about this kind of short-term view based on one single metric. So the good thing about looking at GWP star is it allows us to look at methane in a different way, because it behaves in a different way. It lasts for a different period of time, and actually look at how we use and manage that to best advantage. Now, I'm not saying it gets us out of jail free. And that's my other concern, is on the other side of it, I've seen people piling in and saying, well, this proves we don't need to do anything. I kind of disagree, because, and back to the point of profitability, is, for example, in ruminant industries, we could actually reduce emissions and improve our profitability by cutting out waste. So looking at mortality, looking at morbidity, looking at cattle disease, looking at longevity of animals, all those things could trim back wastage, which trims back emissions, which improves profitability. So there's lots we can do in that space without having to physically reduce cattle numbers. And the last thing I wanted to say about cattle is, we're seeing record prices. I think it's just come back a little bit now, but record prices because we don't have the supply at the moment. Why don't we have the supply? Well, actually, there's been an increase in red meat consumption, probably because of avian influenza is impacting chicken supply. So we've got these whole global dynamics on supply and demand. If we don't have domestic production, we are going to be importing it if consumption doesn't reduce. And that's bad news. So we really need to be able to keep track of our own consumption in this country. And we need to find a better way of measuring emissions so that we're actually doing the right thing to improve the picture without actually making stupid decisions based on measuring things, trying to measure everything very simply on one metric. So yes, long story short, I think we do need to incorporate GWP star, but that shouldn't also then be some excuse for not looking at where we can trim emissions down in the industry.
And just to be clear for people listening who aren't familiar with the terms GWP 100 and GWP star, GWP star is the new metric or revised metric which came out of Oxford University back in, I think, 2018, which accurately characterises the role of methane or with the role of stable ongoing emissions from short-lived greenhouse gases. And when we start to measure accurately, it gives us different options. With GWP 100, where we have this sort of assumption that methane behaves in the same way as carbon dioxide and nitrous oxide, it makes it seem like the most important thing to do is to reduce emissions, and the easiest way to do that is through reducing livestock. But then, of course, it takes away the opportunity to do all these other things that livestock help with, like nutrient cycling, like the water cycling.
Yeah, absolutely. It becomes so big, it obscures everything else, and that's wrong. And also, I mean, this point was raised during the jury: is what are we doing about methane emissions from landfill and industries like that? And I keep seeing quoted again and again is the 2018 Poor and Nemechek paper, which basically pointed to the emissions from ruminant livestock as being, huge. Now, since then, I was really pleased to see in a Which report the other day that they were distinguishing between the global figure, which Joseph Poor himself has said that's global, it's not the same in every country, and what was actually happening in the UK, which is much, much lower. So we need to just understand that it's not a simple solution to just cut out livestock production.
And the key thing is that if we're using metrics at all, they need to describe accurately the situation that they're describing.
Yeah, and look, the thing about GWP star is that if you look at a static livestock population, or even slightly reducing as we are, we have no emissions. We're zero. We're not accumulating any emissions. We're not actually contributing to climate warming through that methane. And actually, if we do get more efficient and we trim back the losses and the waste, then that will keep coming down. And that's with no impact on production. So, really, we should be looking at what's accumulating in the atmosphere as a priority. And yes, trim down the other areas. But again, don't do that in this country when there's still the demand for beef, because we'll end up importing it and just offsetting or offshoring all our emissions, which isn't the answer. So there needs to be a more complex look at this, more of a balance, utilize these metrics, which are going to help achieve change in the right direction. But really, we need to be looking at how we're going to stop this accumulating gases. Sorry, Adrian.
Just something the Scottish government have actually done, which is very positive towards helping, is that we get a beef calf payment that is now predicated on the cow having had a calf within 410 days. So that is a payment that is actually dedicated towards being more efficient, but also being more emissions focused, if you like. So if that cow does not have a calf within the 410 days, there is no subsidy for it whatsoever.
And I think, sorry, just to add to that, I think there's been talk about looking at finishing periods as well, if that goes over a certain period of time. Now, obviously, that disadvantages rare breeds and traditional breeds, but it does actually look to this point of trimming, getting efficiencies in, trimming losses, trimming waste. And just one last thing I wanted to say, you were talking about this change of land use, and something that came up in the jury. We had this great presentation from Jim O'Neill from the Forestry Commission, who talks about multifunctional landscape, about mixing trees and livestock. It's a great solution, and he presented some really workable scenarios. We never talk about this. It's always either, oh, we've got to get rid of livestock and just have trees. Well, there's ways in which we can combine lots of these things and have this multifunctionality, but it's all very black and white scenarios from policymakers. It doesn't take those nuances and that stacking into account.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's something that we've discussed, fairly frequently on Farmgate. And in particular, I'm thinking of a 10-minute interview with Mark Lee from Trepenna Farm up in Cumbria. And if people want to find that and haven't heard it already, then I forget exactly which the podcast is called, but it's about water payments. And it's probably about 10 back if you just scroll back in your feed there. Adrian, do you feel that the focus on emissions and net zero has created resistance in the farming community towards the idea of climate mitigation?
Yeah, I think the key things here are language, and the language that is being put towards farmers feels slightly aggressive, pretty negative, and basically telling us, you are going to do this, and unless you do it, you're basically going to go out of business. So there's a lot of negativity towards the farming community. The language doesn't come across as being encouraging, proactive, collaborative. It's very sort of negative, and it just feels like the industry is quite an easy target at the moment for the policymakers. I go back, I had a discussion around the dining room table with the family the other night, and Chat GPT came up, and my daughter said, well, red meat isn't very environmentally friendly, but at least you're getting to eat something, rather than Chat GPT, it gives you nothing. So I actually put into Chat GPT, are you environmentally friendly? And it came back and said no. But there is no conversation in the wider world about that, because from a policymaker's point of view, I don't think they see that everyone needs red meat, and I'll come on to something in that in a second. But everyone wants the internet or wants Netflix. And therefore, going back to the 5-year cycle, that's quite a difficult conversation to have, to say we need to restrict the internet usage, or we need to not go down the AI route. And on the health side of things, there was a stat that came out recently, and I can't remember the exact figure, but it was over 50% of especially young girls that were having hospital admissions were undernourished on meat protein, and that was causing major health issues.
Can I just add, I saw a stat on ChatGPT related to use of AI, is when people search online, something online, and they use AI like ChatGPT instead of Google, like Google search, 10 times the amount of energy used. So look at where we're going now. This is why things are going into reverse in a lot of countries, because we are just adopting AI, and it's sucking up huge amounts of energy.
And it's actually continuing on from that. There's an education bit for the younger generation. I've been into schools a couple of times and given talks, and I ask the pupils, what do you think happens when you take a picture on your iPhone? And it goes to the cloud. And you're like, right, great. What, the white fluffy thing in the sky? Well, I don't know where it just goes to the cloud. And there is no understanding that the amount of emissions being caused by taking pictures, streaming videos, doing your TikTok, your Snapchat. I'm trying to come across as trendy here. But, all this sort of stuff has a huge implication on carbon and net zero, etc., etc. But that is never discussed.
And just drawing us back to farming, interesting as that is, no doubt, and you're right that there clearly needs to be a conversation that takes into account all of these various different
But
things.
it's the language. Sorry, it's the language is where I'm trying to take it
Yes,
back to. Is that that's never discussed, whereas the farming is always top of the agenda. Farmers must cut their emissions. Farmers must do this.
so certainly farming is at the top of the agenda. And Liz, I wonder if you could just sort of comment on. We discussed earlier on the idea that 3 or 4 years ago, the media and policymakers in broad terms were very, very anti-livestock. That seems to have softened a little bit. I'm still not seeing that much softening from NGOs, from environmental organisations. Again, when you talk to people behind the scenes, there's definite recognition that livestock are important in holistic systems, in delivering for climate and for nature as well, but not so much necessarily from the sort of the campaigning language, if you like. I wonder what you think about that, whether you think that there has been a change in the language and the understanding overall, and also within that, whether you think there are better ways of using policy and language to motivate farmers to address the climate and nature crises.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd like to hope there is some views that, cattle, livestock are not as bad as they were being touted as a few years ago. I don't think we're there yet. I think you mentioned earlier about, rewilding projects and things, Adrian did, integrating livestock. A lot of these things, biodiversity improvements, do still require native cattle, because they graze better, to actually allow some of those biodiversity improvements to be undertaken. I think policy really, really does need to be looked at in this area. We were talking earlier about the fact that farmers have to have a long-term viewpoint on their farm businesses, and we have to plan years in advance, really, as to what direction that's going in. And I think these constant U-turns, look at SFI, it's been open, it's been closed, it's been changed, it's been closed again, it's going to be open again. It doesn't allow farmers to make those long-term decisions. We've touched on nature markets, biodiversity, carbon markets. The government needs to support those. They need policies in place to make sure that those can function, and farmers can then they have the option to utilise those to help support their farming businesses. So a different route of finance for farms. And I think the whole thing, it depends upon coming out of these siloed approaches. Government needs to work across different departments to look at the same challenges. But also we do need that collaborative approach that Amy mentioned earlier on. They need to talk to farms on the ground. It needs to be co-designed with farmers that are able to explain the real implications of some of this policy. I think policy can address the climate crisis, but it can't do it in a little round table in government on its own. It needs to widen that conversation.
Amy, as a behaviour change expert, how do you think the government's approach and language on net zero for agriculture needs to change?
I think it is changing slowly. I mean, we've had some engagement with DEFRA since the jury was held, and I know Liz and another of the jurors, Rob, are in discussion with DEFRA. I won't ask how that's going because that's a separate thing. But and I also see the softening or the sort of slight change of stance from the Climate Change Committee. We are moving in the right direction, but there's so far to go. And I just, it's an element of frustration that we're not doing more co-design to look at how we can have shared goals. So there's quite a lot of research done to show that where you talk about climate resilience and profitability, those things often bring reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, but they also have very tangible benefits for farmers. So it's about how you frame things as well. There's lots of people sitting in policy rooms on computers and modeling and designing how the way forward. And it's all a spreadsheet or a model, and they have the perfect solution, and it relies on all these moving parts doing what they need to do. But people need to do it, and it's not a solution if people aren't doing it. So this is where we might have to sacrifice some of the perfection of this is the perfect outcome to get the emissions reduction we want, with actually working with people who are imperfect, but they are motivated by things that make their lives better, that make their business better, and who also, farmers are incredibly well motivated to do good in the community and to do good for nature. So why aren't we hooking into those things? Because farmers do a lot of stuff they're not paid for already, and there's no recognition of that and no harnessing that to say, how can we, support that to get more greenhouse gas emissions reduction. So it's about working with the flow instead of against it. And part of this, I think, also is rather than farmers being cast as climate villains, which they seem to be quite a lot, is actually they could be climate heroes. So let's give people that feel-good factor and say, hey guys, if you do this, not only does this benefit you, but it will reduce emissions, and that ticks someone else's boxes. So just thinking how we do things differently, behaviour change is such an important factor because, as I said, it's not a solution if people aren't doing it.
Now, we're coming towards the end of the programme, but I do just want to dip into another couple of questions, if I may. And Amy, I'd like to discuss the report's recommendations on co-design that you and Liz have mentioned. Don't we already know what a lot of the solutions are? And won't co-design A, just reduce everything to the lowest common denominator, and B, take ages? And we've just been through a long co-design process with post-Brexit policy.
No, because I think co-design, people imagine it's, well, let's sit down and these are my demands and these are your demands, and let's look at where the tiny bit of overlap is, and that is the lowest common denominator. But what we saw in the jury process was that people who were delivering their position heard what the jurors were saying and actually had a moment of reflection, thinking, oh, maybe I could do things differently. Maybe I'd misunderstood that. That was certainly part of the interesting discussion with DEFRA, is some of the practical challenges with implementing some of this stuff. But equally, I think, and Liz and Adrian can maybe comment, is I think there was an understanding of some of the pressures placed on some of the speakers and why they're making the decisions they are. So that then helps both sides to understand and then maybe negotiate and compromise a bit more to come to something which everybody can live with. So the whole point about engagement is it's the two sides moving together. It's not just trying to find that tiny bit of overlap. It's actually we both need to change and move together and find those common solutions.
And do you think that process is something, in terms of overall overarching policy around net zero, or do you think that the process could be most helpful when it comes to looking at how you deliver or how you sort of work your way through particular challenges? So, for example, no-till and or versus glyphosate. That's one example of a challenge around arable farming and net zero. Is that somewhere where co-design could specifically help?
Oh, in every problem. I mean, it's the basis of conflict resolution. Is it's easy to dismiss things when it's the other, and we're arguing on social media in very binary, polarized arguments, and that just drives a wedge. So social media, I think, is one of the big problems. Is it's all just me. This is my view. This is my truth. This is my view of the world. What we're doing is actually getting people into a room and getting them to discuss those, is they understand each other's point of view. And there's very few people in this world who have want to cause harm or want to be difficult. And when they understand where the other is coming from, that's when we start to see the change. So, that there is a middle ground. There are difficulties with glyphosate and with no-till. There's difficulties with, veganism, with organic farming. There's difficulties with intensive farming. None of these is perfect, but what we don't seem to see is that there's no perfect solution, and actually we need to see if we can harness the best in all these things and come up with a range of solutions that actually move us in the right direction. So discussion is absolutely the key. Understanding the other's point of view, that's how we get progress.
Fantastic. Adrian and Amy, I'm going to come back to you for final thoughts in just a moment. But before I do, Liz, it seems to me that it's very difficult to have a sensible conversation about agricultural land use and ecology without also talking about climate adaptation. Water cycling, soil holding capacity and fertility, they're all so important for food security and for community resilience, but they also make sense to most farmers in a way that perhaps emissions doesn't in quite the same way. What role do you think that adaptation should play going forward?
I think it's going back to the whole sustainable farming practices that we're looking at, and I don't wish to use that in the same term as the latest government grant schemes. But we, as farmers, we do need resilient businesses to be profitable. We need climate resilient businesses to be profitable, and I think adaptation to the changing climate is critical. But there's a lack of knowledge, and also there's the financial ability to transition that can be barriers. So that's probably where we need the support focused policy and market confidence, and helping guide farmers along the journey and helping to de-risk the transition.
Thank you. Adrian, any final thoughts?
Yeah, I think I go back to what Amy and Liz have said. There needs to be a better understanding from both sides about what is practical, what is realistic. I also think there's a big piece out there to educate the younger generation on what is net zero, but also how is your food produced? Where does it come from? A lot of that has been removed from the sort of the curriculum, if you like, in schools. And I think it's crucial that that goes back in. I would say the key message to policymakers is let's be practical and let's have discussions where no one is trying to gain points. We're trying to earn trust and respect between each other, and that is the only way you'll get results. Because if you say something to me and I don't trust or respect you, I don't care what you're saying, I'm not going to do it. But if I've got some trust and respect and it is a two-way thing, then I'm going to go out and sell the message and take that message out and say, this is what we should be doing. And actually, it's made me more profitable and more efficient. And then more and more people will do it.
Yeah, that role of messengers is so important, isn't it? That sort of highlights the importance of peer-to-peer networking, peer-to-peer support. If you hear something from another farmer that you have some time for, you're much more likely to have a look at it and try and implement the same thing.
It's about not being told how to run your business, but running it collaboratively so that everyone feels part of the solution rather than one person being the teacher and the other person being the pupil who's getting sort of beaten around the bottom for being a bad boy, if you like.
Yeah, yeah. Amy, the report came out in April. Are you planning to do more work in this space?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, this was really just something we wanted to get out quickly, so that there was something to show what we'd done and we could start talking about it. There's a longer report nearly done for AFN. And I just want to clarify very quickly, we're not representing AFN's views. AFN very kindly supported this because they are interested in this behaviour change and how the dialogue can help produce behaviour change. So that giving us the freedom to do this exercise, I really appreciate that. So we've got a longer report there and also an academic report aiming to come out later this year, looking at this as a mechanism to achieve change, but also the views that came out from the process. And I just want to say one last thing. Connectivity, the connections, Adrian touched on it there. I just want to look very quickly at one point in the report, and you can download it from AFN website, from my page on there. I think it's tinyurl.com/AFN jury, but I'll have to give you that for the notes. So what the jury recognised was that government working in silos, whereas food and farming crosses, DBT, so this is about UK food and drink sector, DESNES, renewable energy generation, Department of Health and Social Security, that's for health, for education, for defence and security, because food security is security, and we've heard the Prime Minister say that. And, so Ministry of Defence and Education, so that it crosses everywhere. This is everybody's business. So we need to find a way forward on this rather than just keep looking at farming as some convenient way of achieving net zero, which is where it is at the moment.
Fantastic. Look, that's it. That's all we've got time for. Again, I keep doing this at the moment. We're going slightly over time. There's just so much of interest within this report. And again, I feel like we've just kind of scratched the surface and there was so much more we could have discussed as well. Amy mentioned that if you want to read the report, then you can find it on the AFN website. You can also just find it on 8.9. That's the number 8, the word point, the number 9.com. If you use the search and look for Amy Jackson, then it comes up. The article is called Farmers Want to Reduce Emissions, but Net Zero is Slowing Progress, and the link is at the bottom of that article. I'd like to thank my guests, Liz Warner, Amy Jackson and Adrian Ivory. If you've enjoyed listening, please come back and listen to more. Tell your friends, like us, review us and share our links. And please do check out our Farmgate Leaders and Filling the Funding Gap series by scrolling back in your podcast feeds. Farmgate is part of 8.9.com, the land use news channel, which is sponsored by First Milk, Pelican Ag, Rural Solutions, the Usk Catchment Partnership, Agrolo and individual donors. I've been Finlo Costain. Bye for now.